Okay. Yeah, I'm happy to, so I can briefly introduce myself. First of all, thank you so much for having me. And I really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak about the work that I've been doing with a fantastic team of collaborators that's in the area of resilience to substance misuse. I am a senior lecturer at the University of Brighton, and I am a health and community psychologist. Taking a critical perspective. I'm really interested in using visual methods, and I'm really interested in how social relationships and peers have a role to play in resilience development, and that comes forward in this research today. So the project that I'll be discussing actually just wrapped up a couple of weeks ago, which feels a bit like a lifetime. It was a 3.5-year project in the end. Don't worry, I won't have all of that for you today, or it'd be a very, very long talk indeed. But I'm excited to feedback some things that we've developed very fully, and then also some developing findings. And I'm really keen if you have questions or comments or feedback to get that, to hear from you. So I think without further ado, I'll get started. Does that sound okay, Jennifer? Or yeah, great. So let's see if I can share my screen. Let me see what I can do. This is where my facility with Zoom does lead me down. Okay, so there we go. So hopefully, can you see?
Yep, we can see that.
Fantastic, thank you. So I'll preface this by saying that because this is a study about addiction, and because it uses visual methods, there are some images in it that some people, if you're particularly sensitive around those topics, might find a little distressing. There's no photos of active use or anything, but there's some pictures of drugs and alcohol. So just fair warning about that. So yeah, so this is a presentation about resilience for recovery, and specifically taking a relational perspective on the lived experience of recovery from substance misuse. And this is very much from a psychological perspective. We are attending to some aspects of the biopsychosocial nature of addiction, but it's really looking at the social aspect of that. Defining what resilience means in this context, and seeing addiction as a relational challenge and phenomenon, as well as recovery as a relational challenge and phenomenon. You'll see that we've got a nice logo for the big picture, which which houses this project, and there's some links as well, including in the chat, for the project website, and I do encourage you to check that out and to share it far and wide. This was a GCRF funded project from the UK Research Institute Councils, the ESRC, and Arts and Humanities Research Council. Like I said, it's just wrapped up. It was a collaboration between researchers in psychology and public health at the University of Leeds, myself at the University of Brighton. We had a long-standing research fellow who is Assamese and was in Assam, India, where this research takes place. I was due to go to Assam in June 2020. You can imagine what happened. We also had some amazing partner organizations without whom this research not only would have not happened, but would have been useless. Really, we worked very closely with the president of Mind India, Sangeeta Goswami, and had strong partnerships with the Nirman Rehabilitation Facility and Hope Foundation, as well as advisors across the range of public health and addiction specialities, with the aim of producing research that is useful for people and for organizations in changing practice. So a sense of kind of laying the land of why we even started to look at resilience for recovery. This was a project focused on Assam, India, which kind of came about because there were pre-existing relationships with organizations and individuals in Assam. And the team of researchers involved, such as myself, who identified as mental health and resilience specialists, but not necessarily with addiction expertise, became aware through these contacts of the nature of the addiction issues in Assam. And Assam is a state in northeast India. It combines both rural landscapes and a lot of kind of crop and vegetation, but also some very large urban centers where there's a lot of kind of youth activity of drugs, and there's a lot of just variation in terms of the ways, in terms of the socioeconomics. Basically, it's a very unequal society. And the Assam report of the India survey identified adolescent substance misuse disorders as a very urgent public health problem, particularly in city areas and amongst boys specifically. And actually, this might be a bit shocking, but 13% of people who are using drugs in India broadly are children and adolescents, and that can go down very, very, very young. And indeed, from the people that we talked to, some of them reported starting to use substances when they were 8, 9 years old. There are a number of risk factors that make it more likely that somebody will use substances in childhood or adolescence. These include parental use and all of the aspects of exposure and addiction that come alongside it, but also that because drugs are so prevalent in the community and so normalized, there's very easy access. And so when we think about resilience, we like to think about individual vulnerabilities, but maybe vulnerabilities that exist at a community level. And so this is kind of the approach that we took as well, that this is a risk that is happening at the community level, just that it's there for use. And there's also increasing pressures amongst that young people reporting that they were feeling a lot of pressures from competition in the educational system and needing to take on employment and having increased family responsibilities, particularly as they entered adolescence. And one of the things that we're really interested in is the ways in which the Indian context does differ from the UK context. And one of those really is the role of the family and the importance that is played on those family relationships. So I seem to have messed up the animations there, but a little bit more about the public health context. So there is support available for recovery, but this isn't subsidized or provided by the state. There are over 400 non-governmental organizations across India that address prevention and treatment of substance misuse. They're mostly 12-step model programs, and there's a combination of detox centers that do operate out of hospitals and medical situations, and rehab centers that are built around a Narcotics Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous model, as well as other forms of rehab centers. Detox places will be just where you clear the drugs of systems, and then rehab centers have a more prolonged period of care. But what has been argued is that the models and treatments and strategies, especially for prevention, but also for treatment, these came from the West. And while they have been anecdotally very useful and they're certainly popular in India, they don't derive from the Indian context. And there's some tensions within things like the individualistic focus of that, the ways in which certain aspects of culture, such as family and caste systems, are not incorporated into treatment and recovery, that suggests to us and to others that there's perhaps limited appropriateness there. And certainly what there hasn't been really is theorizing of recovery that comes from or is very much inspired by what's happening in India and then moving outwards, right? It's about importing it into that context. So we felt that a resilience perspective on addiction and recovery would be helpful because this would allow us to contextualize addiction, which of course happens on an individual, but you can consider it within an ecological systems framework. And that's not something that NA or AA do routinely. They're focused on supporting the individual. They draw a lot on peer approaches, but they're not seeing this as kind of something that's happening within a community context and the risks or strengths that can arise from that. And we also thought this would be helpful for having a developmental approach, which again is not part of the traditional models, where we're seeing these as young people who are, have been entangled with addiction at a certain point in their lives, right? That has impact for who they will become, and where the kind of strengths and options that there are for recovery have to do with them being young people as well. And it also, of course, being resilience orients towards aspects of protection and promotion, identifying assets, and promoting public health and individual well-being. And what we found as well is that funders do want multi-tiered, youth-centered approaches, and so this works very well. This was a very big project, and I'm only going to speak to one aspect of it, but to give you a sense of what the aims were, is we just wanted to start by enhancing insights into the experiences of risk, resilience, and recovery amongst youth substance use. And we wanted to do this in a way that would promote young Assamese people's voices, and that is a contested terminology, but certainly amplifying their own lived experience and creating opportunities through analysis of data and the creation of artifacts such as posters and films to have they themselves work to reduce stigma, raise public awareness, and inform policy and practice. And we were really interested in seeing how photo voice as a particular tool could be used to accomplish these aims. And I'm going to show you later on either an aspect of the recovery model that draws on this, or a participant video. We'll see which we've got time for, but they're both great. Or we can, such a small group, we can see which one we'd like to see. So this study that I'm going to focus on today had a particular research question of looking at addicts in recovery, and they prefer the term addicts, so that's what I will say. We wanted to know what protective mechanisms operate across different ecological levels to support resilience for recovery to substance misuse. And we're drawing from that the lived experience of young Assamese addicts who are currently in recovery. So that's where we were heading with this. And you start to see here some images that were selected by one of the young people. And I'll explain a bit how we used photo voice or photo elicitation. Can I ask quickly, is anyone familiar with photo voice or photo elicitation? No, okay, fantastic. So stop me if I'll try to explain it, but please stop me and I'll show you some examples of how this is used. I've got two screens and I've accidentally stuck you guys on one, so that's why I'm like turning to the side, but it's a bit awkward, so sorry I'm doing that. So we did photo voice interviews with 15 young adults who were aged roughly 19 to 24 years. I'll return to what photo voice is, but they had to be in recovery for at least 1 year, and the vast majority of them we recruited through rehab centers. There were a couple of people who were involved in rehab centers but hadn't themselves gone through the process, but by far most of them had been in these centers. And essentially, photo elicitation, well, photo voice specifically, is a process through which participants are invited to take pictures or create images that represent their experiences. And so this might be literally going around with a camera and taking photos of aspects of their life, people in their life, meaningful places. It can be things like going on the internet and finding some memes that really speak to you, or going back into your photo archives and finding some pictures. And these were all things that our participants did. And they were just asked to create images, bring in images that spoke to their story of addiction and recovery. And these are then used as prompts within an interview setting. We analyzed transcripts using thematic analysis, and that analysis has been and is being validated with community partners. And there was also ongoing relationships with a number of the addicts as they took part in other stages of the process to perhaps make make posters speaking to policymakers and young people, or participate in video filmmaking. I'll give you a sense of the kinds of things that people brought. So these are a series of images that were presented by one of the female addicts. And like many people, she started with a photograph of herself in childhood. Many people decided to start their story of their addiction in that place. And then, you know, she brings in this like manga picture of a bunch of girls, schoolgirls, right? And I'd invite you to kind of reflect about what she's saying so far, even, and think about in yourself, in your body, and looking at this. What does it do to you to see these images? What, without knowing anything about her story, what does this bring up for you? What meaning? You can't help but try to work some meaning into it, right? What sense do you make of this? I mean, I look at this and I think, oh, there's something about belonging with a group and the importance of being with a group of other girls at that point in your life. They seem really happy. They seem really excited, right? Anticipating something. So maybe this speaks to what was important to her at the time. And this is only my interpretation. She will have taken this picture and reflected on it in a certain way. There's also a picture of train tracks, which actually was a bit of a visual theme. Many people either spoke about using drugs at train tracks or spoke metaphorically about the idea of traveling and going somewhere, or having their life go on track, off track, or making choices. And this came up a lot. And she also has a picture in here of a visibly pregnant woman who is crying because pregnancy loss and abortion was part of her narrative of addiction and recovery. And so we can try directly to make meaning of these things, but what we can do is more think about these as prompts that people are bringing in to help express things that are really difficult to talk about, that are quite complex, and they kind of start to anchor the narrative in an interesting way, right? Rather than doing a biographical interview or just semi-structured interview, you know, tell me about your life. It starts to bring new things in. And I don't know about you, but, you know, as I said, I didn't do the interviews, right? Ragini Dwara, our research fellow, did. And sadly, and something that bothers me still, just because I find it as a researcher very challenging, I didn't make it to Assam, right? You know, but what do you have here? I think it's very difficult to look at this and not feel some kind of empathy, right? Or some kind of connection. That we could do a survey with this person, but it wouldn't capture quite the same. It wouldn't be wrong, but it wouldn't capture quite the same kind of knowledge that we might have, which gives us a little bit of insight about why use photo voice, particularly if you're looking at resilience, and particularly if you're looking at something that you might want to view relationally. So there are some criticisms of semi-structured interviews, and I maintain a love of semi-structured interviews, but one of the, some of the issues around it is that they can seem like other kinds of interviewing situations that people have had, medical interviews or encounters with teachers. It's us as researchers or practitioners that are setting the terms of it. It's very difficult to challenge that. The researcher can introduce and influence data within that context. And if we want to try to open up something as new as we can, it's really helpful to have different sorts of techniques. This means primarily that we have to work to not get caught up in what we think we know. So, for example, we might think that, in terms of new insights, we might think we understand something about what causes people to start addiction, but actually, or rather, let's say, in the peer recovery programs, it's not uncommon for people to be encouraged to tell their story, okay? But what we didn't want to do, as mentioned, is we didn't want to just kind of be seeking the efficacy for an NA model, right? We want to be looking at what else is going on with recovery. And if we make this like any other time that they've told their story of addiction and recovery, we might get just the same thing. And some of those aspects of the step models will be very helpful and very useful and should go into a model that comes from this community. But we want to be able to step outside of that. And we want to be able to challenge that perhaps, or see where this is about rhetoric rather than their own experiences. So having a photograph based interview can be really helpful for this. And we also know that within an interview context where there's big power differentials, that can be really hard to engage people. And certain aspects of lived experience can be very hard to express. Addiction is by its very nature really chaotic, and people may not remember very well, right? And actually having these as kind of anchors and ways of expressing things is really useful. So we started off with Ragini offering, is there a photograph you'd like to share first? And then from there, the addict would begin their narrative, and Ragini had some questions that she might additionally ask, such as what were your relationships with other people like at this point in your life? And some people relied very heavily on the photographs and very sequentially. Some of them had them scrolled out on the table and didn't do much with them, but they had used those photographs to kind of generate within themselves a narrative and kind of making meaning of what they'd been through. And it also helped with kind of asking about like what advice they'd give. This helped this to become more grounded in their own lived experience rather than just kind of stereotypes. So I'm not going to go through everything that we came out with, but through analysis of transcripts, my aspect of the research, we identified different resilience for recovery mechanisms. And the first of these was just engaging with precursors of prevention and de-addiction, right? And this looks more like public health actually, and it might look quite basic, but this speaks to something about actually the resilience perspective, that this adds a layer of social ecology approach to it. And it also shows us that recovery is not a linear journey, but is iterative, and in the quote unquote failures, you gain knowledge. So one of the first themes that there was gaining awareness of rehab and recovery services. As I mentioned, this isn't a state sanctioned recovery program. What a good outcome might be of a failed rehab attempt, and again, failed in quotation marks, is that previously the addict did not know that rehab existed. Their family did not know that rehab existed. And now they do. And that was spoken of in the accounts, that nobody knew that there was anything that could be done, or they didn't know that there was anything other than detox, and now they know. And so then the next time that there's use, at least there's kind of feeding that into things. There's also gaining understanding of addiction and awareness of withdrawal symptoms, which is very lacking because there is no curriculum around that, and there's no public health campaigns around that. And interrupting the physiological processes of addiction. And this was interesting because the addicts definitely felt that that had to be done. You had to get the drugs out of your system. But there's a lot of, it's difficult to then say that's not enough. And so in terms of some of the outcomes of this is we've been working with practitioners to say that the work of getting the drugs out of the system is very valuable, but many people who are working at the coalface of this don't necessarily appreciate the degree to which that's not enough. And families don't necessarily know that that's not enough. The other kind of mechanisms that we spoke about, in which I'll spend a bit more time on, are repairing relationships and structuring a life of recovery. So unsurprisingly, having taken a relational lens, repairing relationships did emerge as something that was, kind of focused on in the research. One of these things was just about developing a sense of self-love where previously that had been absent or obliterated. And others were that the addict wanted to repair ruptured intimate relationships. The process of addiction creates a lot of disruption and chaos. it creates a lot of issues that create ruptures. And so alongside all of the work that they're doing, the addict has to repair those intimate relationships. We also identified that families have to adapt to a life of recovery. So just as the addict has to have a sense that they are themselves an addict in perpetual recovery, the family has to, or ought to, they don't always, but it's helpful if they identify themselves as being a family that is supporting a journey of recovery and acknowledge that they themselves might need to make some changes. Additionally, we spoke about structuring a life of recovery, which involves I'll come back to this. Okay, so from example, as how this works, in using photo voice, you can see that as we're from data generation, but also as we're doing the analysis, we can access these photographs. And if I use an example of the theme of structuring time adaptively in order to structure a life of recovery, and this might sound, if I say just the name of like, well, you get up on time, you brush your teeth, you sweep the floor, you go to your meetings, you go home. Sounds easy. If you're in recovery, it's actually incredibly, incredibly hard, and you're restructuring your life completely around activities that used to be in service of addiction to something new, where perhaps if you're a young person, you've never known anything different, right? And some aspect of the kind of emotionality behind this, you might find from these photographs where there's, a person has selected themselves as a child. They also spoke about their friendship group, and you can see the background of train tracks there, right? They used to use that train tracks. And then this person, they selected a meme of a caterpillar turning into a butterfly saying, "Give yourself time." And they spoke about structuring their time in recovery in a new way. I see this as valuable time. I'm not like just passing time with things like just eating, sleeping, keeping away from substances, and then it's done. It's not like that. And we know this from resilience, that mental health is not the absence of illness. Recovery is not the absence of addiction. It's the creation of something new. Okay. The new things, the ones that went away, I have to learn those things too, like how again to build a relationship with someone, how to talk to them. And they're able to, using the visual methods and in reflections, really speak to that in a very powerful way. Similarly, where an addict is speaking about repairing their intimate relationships, they come to recognize their impact on loved ones and acknowledge the need to gain or regain trust. And one of the aspects that we found very kind of culturally relevant here is that family relationships and family obligations really often operated as catalysts to spur people into recovery. And not in a shame way, not I felt so bad about this, although that does come up, but in terms of I want to fulfill my family obligations that I really value. And so Smita was a caretaker for her brother. And so she noted that if today after my using, if I relapse, if I have to go for treatment for 3, 4, 5 months, who will look after my brother? So this keeps her going. And they define the relationships in terms of warmth, but in terms of reciprocity and being able to fill roles. So for example, Manav just saying her sister just coming to her with small problems and such. So I think this underpins a relational perspective because you relate through the data generation. It creates quite a strong, if ephemeral, bond between the researcher and researched. It empowers participants to really bring their own agenda to the table and allows them to talk about things that are often embodied and often relational and can be captured in nonverbal means very well. And because you then have these artifacts, it makes the data more rich. And enhances voice in permitting people to speak more directly with others. I wanted to show you some of the participant generated posters. So anyone who took part in interviews was invited to make a poster. And we've been using these in policy briefings, in educational materials, and in workshops and talks like this. And these are messages that come directly from people. And specifically when we're looking at speaking to young people who are perhaps on the cusp of this, it's really often very powerful to hear messages from people who've been through addiction. And the addicts, in creating these materials, they often said this for them was very powerful and healing, in having an opportunity to speak and perhaps make others realize what can be facing them. So I'm going to just kind of bring out some theoretical conclusions, and then I want to stop with very short trailer of a video to leave you with that. What we're finding is that recovery is iterative, it's non-linear, and it's a daily journey, and that really is well supported by resilience theory, however you wish to draw from that. And we've found that resilience mechanisms do operate at different levels in the addict's lived experience to support recovery, whether that's stuff that can happen at the broad population level, such as public health awareness around symptoms and addiction, seeing families as assets for prevention and de-escalation, and even things like supporting activities and youth employment activities. And then also tailored psychosocial approaches for higher risk families and individuals, such as working with families on relational repair and identifying young people who, because of their parents' use, might be more vulnerable. So resilience promotion can also look like things that have a range of mental health and physical benefits, and already draw on existing systems in schools and cultural communities. So I wanted to just share a diary of a recovering drug addict. So this does have some, I have to stop sharing in order to bring in the different window. So I'm going to do that. Oh, thank you, Liliana. Let me just bring that up. Go. And it's 1.5 minutes, so not very long. Okay, thank you. So yeah, you can watch that full video at the project website. And I would, something else is playing, sorry. There we go. YouTube's just like starting and doing its own thing. But yes, if you like, you can watch that video and others on the website, and those have been doing the rounds at different online film festivals and receiving a lot of awards and commendations, including People's Selection. So please do. And that's it from, I think I'll stop talking now. I've gone on for a very long time. Thank you very much for your patience.
Many thanks, Rebecca. It was really interesting, and I've never heard of a photo. What was it called again? A photo
voice
before. Yeah. So that's a new method for me. Thank you. And does anyone have any questions or comments for Rebecca?
Hi. That was great. Thank you. Really interesting. Thing I was just thinking about as well was I thought the photo voice perspective was really good, and it was really nice to see examples, because it really does connect you to what they're feeling in some way, because you have your own reaction to it. What I was thinking was it would be interesting to see perhaps the people who've been in the same risk environments, who got exposed to the same risks, but have not become drug addicts, and what their resilience factors were and their photo voice in terms of comparison.
Yes.
Myself,
well, I'm pleased to say, Steph, that we did that study.
Well, there you go.
We've done that study. Though, and actually one of the videos, I think it's on the website, but if not, it will shortly be, because we've done quite a number of films. There's one called Taint in the Lush Green, which has also been on some of the film festivals, was actually made with some young people who had been in the same communities, but either did not use drugs or had casually used and not gone into addiction. So again, because it's such a huge project, I didn't focus on everything, but we did do a study with young people aged 16 to 19 who were in the same communities and had not used or had not gone into addiction despite that. And that was one of the things that we wanted to know, is that you can't, not directly comparing, but what did they identify as things that we would call protective mechanisms? Where did their journeys diverge? Where sometimes you do see the same risk factors, or you see the very same situations, and yet some of them handle things differently. And there was actually, again, with the train tracks, one of them, I remember, had spoken about actually taking herself to the train station to write and think about how her life could go one way and her life could go the other. And I was like, oh, you are an artist or a researcher, I don't know, a bit of both. Yeah. Because yes, and I think that's one of the issue, kind of contextual aspects of this research, is that it's people who their resilience is in that they are on a recovery journey. And that is how we would define resilience. For other people, it will be about not using, but acknowledging that there are people who are already in use, and we want to work on de-addiction. We have to look at multiple different participant groups, and they also found the photo voice technique often very helpful. We did ask for their reflections at the end, which is how I can feel confident saying these things. And we're going to have a methodological paper coming out, hopefully. But I've got edits on my desk for the paper that refers to that study, so please do watch this space. Yeah.
We have a hand up from Ellie.
Hi, yeah, thank you for your talk. It was really, really interesting. I think at the start you briefly mentioned something.
Oh, you've gone mute.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, you mentioned something about differences between family structure in India and the UK. I was wondering, did you do kind of cross-cultural research on that, or is that just something you very briefly touched on?
So what we can say, there's this kind of background research. We didn't directly look at it because it wasn't viewed as a comparative study. We haven't done this project in the UK, although that would be something interesting to do. So we just kind of know from background and our own research experiences into that. But we're thinking about things that like there's more strict gender roles, and in the gender binary terms, the two genders do tend to be parented a bit differently, and addiction is possible in both genders, but it's very heavily skewed towards boys. And the ways in which recovery is viewed is also different between boys and girls, and this partly has to do with family structures around protecting girls' honor And whereas boys they can kind of get away with things a bit more because they're meant to be out kind of playing and roaming. We also found that there's, more extended family units. And so this means that if you were to focus just on the immediate family, either as a source of risk or as a source of strengths and assets, you'd be cutting out quite a bit. And so we had things that were very kind of pragmatic, like it would be quite reasonable to recommend broadly in this context that you might send the addict away to live with a cousin or an uncle. That's probably not as likely to happen in the UK context. That can work very well, but what a lot of things weren't appreciated amongst the families that our addicts had was that kind of disrupted some of the social systems and didn't change some of the underlying psychologies where people were kind of ending up seeking solace in drugs. But these are things that don't happen quite so much here. Of course they do, but that's not the kind of immediate setup that is certainly, that services are not structured in that way, let's say. The services are structured to have the immediate family involvement. We also found things like just there's kind of differentiation in terms of what the father will do and what the mother will do. But mostly about kind of external members of the family and that being really, really vital, and people wanting to have that family involvement in a way that perhaps the assumption is that wouldn't be desirable here. Although a bit of collectivism doesn't necessarily hurt anyone. Yeah, I think there's an interesting point around like what are, in theory, it's good to have things that kind of come of the culture, but what do you really mean by that? And how do you ensure that you're working out of, I love the cat visitor. How do you ensure that you're working out of the realities or lived experience realities of those differences rather than just drawing on kind of generalizations? So again, that's why I'm kind of hedging a bit about like, there's things that we know demographically are different. And then because this is a qualitative study, it's all very much about the nuances of those participants and transferring that to relevant circumstances, but not attempting to be general. And that's not what we were trying to do. And we'd be some ways off doing a comparative study on a statistical basis, if only because the infrastructure would need to be there for getting those kinds of numbers within the rehab centers. And that's few years work, or if somebody else is doing it, then that's good. That's not what we were aiming for right now.
I'm just going to, it's slightly off topic, but it's just reminding me the photo voice aspect of it, which I find really interesting. There's a project in Manchester where they gave homeless people cameras and made a vote. Have you heard of that project? It's a similar sort of thing.
Homeless people are, so generally, anytime you're working with a marginalized group, it's a good opportunity to use photo voice because it just has an effect of upending a lot of the received knowledge. And so a colleague of mine has done a photo voice study with homeless people, but down here in Brighton. And there was actually, I just saw that there's been a special issue around photo voice, 30 years of photo voice that's been put out. I will link to it. Actually, I haven't read it, so I can't speak to like how good it is, but the people who kind of developed the photo voice method have advertised that. And really photo voice is quite helpful for any marginalized group where there might be wariness around traditional research encounters, particularly like maybe they're like, well, I've done this before and it didn't leave me any better, or why should I trust you because you're part of an establishment that I've not had good relationships with. So housing precarious people with learning difficulties often find this a useful method because it doesn't rely on verbal fluency so much. Sex workers, children and young people quite broadly, who else, and people with kind of severe mental distress, again, kind of the chaotic thinking can, and in a very good way, can lend itself well to this method, because it's just a different way of relating and communicating. So, I mean, I still do love semi-structured interviews, and I do like statistics very much as well. So I see this as a very useful addition to these other methods, where anytime you want to generate something new that is perhaps more drawing on their lived experience, and particularly where you have marginalization or power differentials, it's often useful. And it's quite cool as well. Like, people found it fun, you know, and that does help, I think, if you're trying to have engaged participants and have them open up. Yeah.
And presumably really good for wider dissemination as well. I mean, did you mention a film festival a while back that you're doing this at?
Yeah, so again, I'll just, I sound like a broken record. See our website, please. But have a look at the website, because if you scroll down to the project outcomes, there's just a whole bit where you can see where the films have been selected. And I think more of the films are going on, but we're just kind of finalizing things. But yeah, basically so we've been able to show the films at educational events and working with organizations and putting things in schools, but also as part of policy briefings. And they've just been going on all these different online film festivals. So some of them are at there's a small world of film festivals that is related to addiction, but in general, just broad interest. And that's also really useful, because then if they're being shown in India or even here, it's bringing a new perspective, and you just don't know where that's going to go and how that's going to shift what people do. So this project has just finished, and there was a social media campaign associated with it as well that tried to get these films and such into people's feeds. You can also look for the Big Picture Project Resilience on Instagram and on, I think we've got Twitter as well. So it won't be as active now, but only just, what is it? We've also got, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And if you go to the project website, there'll be the socials linked for that. And those also will have links to a lot of the videos, either in full or in part, and they're worth a watch. But yeah, it's quite nice. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with the debates around having participant voice, like, can you actually give people voice? What does that mean? But one way of doing that, or attempting to do that, can be just minimizing the distance between them and the audience, really. Yeah, so I'll see. I'm just trying to link to our socials. Great, thank you, Jana. Oops, sorry, I keep sending that to, just do that, if that's of interest to you. I've not seen the Twitter myself, I stay off Twitter, but the rest I've seen and can speak to.
Are there any other questions for Rebecca?
I just had a question about asking about resilience more broadly. So when you're using the term with participants, that's something I find quite hard, is how to actually phrase the word resilience, because it means such different things to different people. So I found sometimes I toy with the idea of asking participants, how have you coped? But then coping is slightly different, recovery is slightly different. So I know you spoke about asking participants to bring photos that kind of convey their experience of risk, resilience, recovery. Do you kind of separate out those three terms, or do you just take it as how the participants interpret it?
Yeah, so we will have our own different views, but part of the project for us was defining what resilience means, really. That will have some, we'll take being in recovery as an indication of resilience, but not the process of it, right? That's an indicator. But in terms of what we ask the participants to do, what we ask them is just to they're used to the word recovery because they've been in recovery and addiction. And so they're familiar enough with those terms. And we just ask them to generate images or collect images that help explain that story of addiction and recovery. And we don't really use the term resilience with them. And I imagine that as there's more interaction with the participants in later stages of the project, that might come up, but it doesn't actually, it's not used really with them. And again, that can be quite nice because it allows them really to pick where they're going with it. And you know, in terms of the analysis, I had my eye on different levels because that's my knowledge of resilience theory and wanting to apply a social ecological developmental approach to it. We're not asking them to go through and pick out different protective mechanisms or even really speak to things beyond their individual experience. Because if it's not part of their narrative, we're going to say, in their experience, it doesn't make a difference. Right. So I'm trying to think, you know, when you've been immersed in it so long, you forget where you're surprised. But I mean, they're just things that you would think matter and then just don't seem to, like having, you know, hitting rock bottom. It wasn't necessarily a thing, right? Like that's part of an NA story. But it wasn't really part of what they talked about. And actually, the self-love theme only came up a couple of times. And that was identified by community partners as something that they worked on in their rehabilitation support. But it only actually came up a couple of times. And so initially I left it off because it didn't feel like it was something that was in there. But it's kind of in there as an absence really, and that people don't focus on that. They focus on the relational repair. And then in the end, they kind of get to a place of self-love, but that's not where they don't see that as important really. And they don't, oh yes, is the other thing. Many of them will have gone to schools where at some point, we know just from speaking to the centers and the policymakers, there would have been some drug education. Not a single addict, and only a handful of the young people not in addiction. They did not talk about this education. For all intents and purposes, it did not happen, or they were absent that day. Which is shocking because you know, presumably the intention was there for that to have a preventative effect. From their perspective, it did not. Yeah. It's a bit disappointing, really, but yeah.
That is really great. Thank you, Rebecca. And we're going to have to tie it up there because we have reached the time, but thank you so much. That was a really interesting presentation, both on the methods you used and what you found as well. And I hope everyone else found it equally useful.
Thank you so much for sharing your afternoon with me.